We have a serious problem in America. Millions of people are now addicted to opioids, such as heroin, morphine, and a plethora of prescription painkillers. Around 85% of the global opioid supply is consumed in the United States. Overdoses are now the leading cause of death of Americans under the age of 50. The white population has been most devastated, with so-called deaths of despair skyrocketing, while every other demographic has seen a decrease. Around 90% of new heroin users are white, with over 70% of those users first getting hooked through prescription drugs. Altogether, over one-third of all adults in America were prescribed opioids in 2016. Opioids come from opium, which comes from the sap of a poppy plant's seed pod. Opium is a complex chemical cocktail containing sugars, proteins, fats, water, meconic acid, plant wax, latex, gums, ammonia, sulfuric and lactic acids, and numerous alkaloids, most notably morphine, codeine, noscapine, papaverine, and thebaine. All of the alkaloids, apart from thebaine, are used medicinally as analgesics. The opioid analgesics are of inestimable value because they reduce or abolish pain without causing a loss of consciousness. They also relieve coughs, spasms, fevers, and diarrhea. Opioid drugs work the same way, whether it is heroin or prescription pills like oxycodone, hydrocodone, Vicodin, or Percocet. Opioids quickly reduce the perception of pain by binding to opioid receptors in the brain and other organs in the body. With repeated administration of opioids, the brain's production of naturally occurring opioids decreases, which accounts in part for the extreme discomfort, headaches, body aches, diarrhea, and vomiting that ensues when the drug is not present. These withdrawal symptoms, in addition to the sense of well-being when on opioids, leads to high rates of addiction after only a few uses. In higher doses, incredible euphoria ensues, but stimulation of opioid receptors in deeper brain regions results in drowsiness and respiratory depression, which can lead to overdose deaths, especially when mixed with other drugs such as alcohol or cocaine. In 1 year, opioids killed 10 times as many people as have died in alleged terror attacks over the past 20 years combined. And even those numbers are suspect, given the spurious nature of the criminal government of the United States and the fake news filling the mainstream media. And although the government and media do cover this epidemic, the talking heads will only focus on the malignant manifestations of this disease, but never trace the symptoms to their root cause, showing how our sick society came to be. They won't show how this epidemic originated and why white people are the most affected, as it would become clear that the government and mainstream media are actually complicit in this massacre of Americans. The onslaught of opioids, whether in the form of prescription pain pills or illegal heroin, has been manufactured by the masters of America. Profits are a big component to this scheme, but we are dealing with forces that are able to print up money from thin air and loan it out at interest. They see money only as a means to an end and not the end itself. So what is their end game? Total social control and genocide. Before going more in depth into today's tragedy, we need to understand how we got here. The current opioid crisis has shocked millions of people with its devastating effects. But this is most certainly not the first time opium has devastated a country. Let's get some more background information and explore some of the long history of opium's use as a medicine and recreational drug. Fossilized poppy seeds and other archaeological evidence points to consumption of the poppy plant by Neanderthals and our ancient human ancestors, who likely used the plant for other reasons than just getting high from the opium. The first time the opium poppy enters the stage of recorded history is around 4000 BC. It was being cultivated in Lower Mesopotamia, where it was called Pul Gil, which means the joy plant. The Sumerians would pass the plant to the Assyrians, who would in turn pass it to the Babylonians, who would then introduce it to the Egyptians. In Egypt, the cultivation of opium flourished. Medical papyri had hundreds of prescriptions containing opium. This is about 1/3 of their formulas that have been discovered so far. Priest physicians promoted the household use of opium preparations, which were called fabaceum, after the highly potent poppies grown near the capital city of Thebes. Egyptian pharaohs were entombed with opium artifacts by their side. Egyptian trade reached the Phoenicians and Minoans, who would then transport the opium across the Mediterranean Sea into Carthage, Greece, and other parts of Europe. In Greek mythology, the goddess of agriculture, Demeter, was searching for her daughter Persephone when she came upon a place called Mekone, or City of Poppies, where she discovered that the sap of the poppy capsule immediately granted relief from her sorrow. This is why Demeter is often seen with a bouquet of poppies. Other gods were also shown with poppies, such as Nyx, the goddess of night, Hypnos, the god of sleep, Morpheus, the god of dreams, as well as Thanatos, the god of death. Throughout the ages, many physicians and healers believed the poppy plant was a divine blessing, variously calling it the sacred anchor of life, milk of paradise, the hand of God, and the destroyer of grief. In Homer's epic, the Iliad, Helen of Troy served opium with wine as a potion to cause forgetfulness of evil. Around 460 BC, Hippocrates, who is known as the father of medicine, dismissed the magical or divine properties of opium, but did affirm its usefulness as a narcotic and styptic to stop hemorrhaging. Physicians would grind the whole plant or extract the opium. Roman physician Galen listed its medicinal uses for various problems.
Resist poison and venomous bites. Cures chronic headache, vertigo, deafness, epilepsy, apoplexy, dimness of sight, loss of voice, asthma, coughs of all kinds, spitting of blood, tightness of breath, colic, the lilac poison, jaundice, hardness of the spleen stone, urinary complaints, fever, dropsies, leprosies, the trouble to which women are subject, melancholy, and all pestilences.
The drug was sold everywhere on the streets of ancient Rome. Around 330 BC, Alexander the Great, the Macedonian conqueror, used opium to help his troops cope with the pain of marching in battle, as they traveled and fought through Persia and India and introduced opium to the subjugated people. It was around 400 AD when Arab traders first introduced opium to the Chinese. During the Crusades, which lasted until the 13th century, opium was brought back to medieval Europe from the Middle East in the form of new medicines, which then became rather popular, being used throughout much of the Middle Ages. However, during the Holy Inquisition, opium was mostly removed from the historical record, since anything from the East was seen as being linked to the devil. In 1492, after King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella reconquered Spain from Muslim rule, they had to find a new source for opium as well as sugar and tea, as they were now cut off from Middle Eastern sources. They sent Christopher Columbus on an expedition to try to find a trade route to Asia, but he ended up in the New World instead. While he did not find opium, he did bring back tobacco, which the Portuguese would bring to China around 1500, where opium would be mixed in with the tobacco. The first smoking of opium began, delivering a quicker and more pleasurable high, but this also increased the likelihood of addiction, a problem that China would deal with in the centuries to come. Around this same time, opium returned to European medical literature during the Reformation of the 1500s, with Paracelsus concocting laudanum, which was prescribed as a painkiller. These black pills, called stones of immortality, were made up of opium fabaceum, citrus juice, and quintessence of gold. Other ingredients were also used. In 1680, English apothecary Thomas Sydenham introduced Sydenham's laudanum, a compound of opium, sherry wine, and herbs. His pills, along with others of the time, became popular remedies for numerous ailments. Laudanum caused addiction in many notable figures, such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, Charles Dickens, Lewis Carroll, Edgar Allan Poe, and others. It seemed no self-respecting author or poet could call himself such unless he was a user. Poems such as The Raven seem to be the products of opium dreams, with nebulous moods and fantastic images that reflect typical effects of opium. The mixture became so popular that it was prescribed for a wide range of complaints, from menstrual cramps to colicky babies to mystery ailments to injuries. Laudanum addiction caused numerous deaths. Large parts of Europe and Asia got hooked on opium, and its trade would increase during the centuries to come. In China, the smoking of opium would become widespread after being popularized by the Dutch around 1700. 30 years later, the Chinese Emperor Yung Chang prohibited the recreational use of opium, but to no avail. In 1750, England took over the bulk of the opium trade through the control of India. This almost bankrupted China, an increasingly addicted country. In 1767, China imported 2,000 chests of opium per year from the British East India Company. In 1793, the British East India Company established a monopoly on the opium trade, forbidding Indian poppy growers from selling to anyone else. In 1799, China's Emperor Qia King banned opium completely, making trade in poppy cultivation illegal. In 1800, the British Levant Company purchased nearly half of the opium coming out of Smyrna, Turkey, strictly for importation to Europe and the United States. In 1803, German scientist Friedrich Serturner synthesized morphine, which was named after the Greek god of dreams, Morpheus. The new form of opium, which had longer-lasting effects and was seen as being safe and reliable, was hailed as God's own medicine. After advocating the virtues of morphine, Serturner came to realize the deadly consequences after his wife died from an overdose. He tried to warn the world, but it was already too late. In the early 1800s, fortunes were being made smuggling Turkish opium to China. At around the same time, England's opium use reached an all-time high at 22,000 pounds of opium. In India, the British Empire had granted a monopoly for the manufacture of cotton goods, silk, and most importantly opium to Iraqi Jew David Sassoon, who had been the court Jew of Ahmed Pasha, the governor of Iraq, who had been ousted for corruption, causing the Sassoon family to flee to Bombay, which was the gateway into India and the Far East. The Jewish Encyclopedia of 1905 states that Sassoon expanded his opium trade into China and Japan. He placed his 8 sons in charge of the major opium exchanges in China. According to the 1944 Jewish Encyclopedia, he employed only Jews in his business, and wherever he sent them, he built synagogues and schools for them. He imported whole families of fellow Jews and put them to work. Sassoon's sons were busy pushing opium into Canton, China. Between 1830 to 1831, they trafficked 18,956 chests of opium, with part of the profits being sent to Queen Victoria and the British government. It was claimed that the hard-working Chinese were entitled to a harmless luxury. They said the opium trade in less respectable hands would be taken over by desperados, pirates, and marauders. In 1831, the Manchu emperor ordered the trade be stopped. 2,000 chests of Sassoon opium were seized and thrown into the river. Sassoon was outraged and demanded Britain retaliate. They did. And thus began the Opium Wars, with British ships attacking cities and blockading ports. British soldiers decimated the Chinese, who had been weakened by the decades of opium abuse. The war was ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking. The Sassoons were granted exclusive trade rights in all port cities and were paid back the cost of their lost opium. The British took 21 million pounds from the Chinese for the cost of the war. This all was not enough, however, as the Sassoons demanded rights to move opium throughout all of mainland China. The Chinese resisted, and so began the Second Opium War, which lasted from 1856 to 1860, with a number of treaties introduced and battles fought. Lord Palmerston declared that all of China must be opened up to the uninhibited flow of opium. The British again won the war and took Hong Kong as a colony, along with large sections of Amoy, Canton, Shanghai, Ningpo, and Foochow. the Sassoons became even more incredibly rich, licensing opium dens and collecting large fees in each British-occupied area. Many considered the Sassoons the Rothschilds of the East, and ties between these two rich Jewish families were cemented when Solomon Sassoon married Aline Caroline de Rothschild in 1887. Their wealth was made off of addicting and debilitating a vast swath of Asia. But Asia was certainly not alone in dealing with rising addiction. British opium imports rose from a brisk 91,000 pounds in 1830 to an astonishing 280,000 pounds in 1860. Youngsters were introduced to the pleasures of opiates at their mother's breast. Harassed baby-minders and overworked parents found opium-based preparations were a dependable way to keep their children happy and docile. Godfrey's cordial, a soothing syrup of opium tincture effective against colic, was quite popular. But Godfrey's cordial had its own competitors: Street's Infant's Quietness, Atkinson's Infant's Preservative, and Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. Over in America, there was a slightly different history. Opium poppies had been cultivated in the first few centuries for a number of uses, including dissolving the resin in whiskey to relieve coughs, aches, and pains. Thomas Jefferson famously cultivated opium poppies at his garden in Monticello. Poppies were sold at the Monticello gift store until 1991, when the gardens were ripped up and the seeds burned after a drug bust at the nearby University of Virginia. In the 1850s, morphine was even used as a cure for alcoholism, even though it was known how addictive the drug is. The reasoning was that morphine addicts were much more withdrawn and less violent than alcoholics, so this was essentially seen as the lesser of two evils. Also, in the 1850s, a revolutionary invention changed the way modern medicine, especially opioids, is delivered to a person. When a drug is ingested, it takes some time to reach the bloodstream and have the effects felt. And with smoking, the effects are quicker. But this is not fast enough when dealing with serious injuries that need immediate relief. This all changed with the introduction of the syringe, a hollow hypodermic needle fine enough to pierce the skin and inject drugs directly into the bloodstream. Both in Europe and America, members of high society and middle-class professionals alike would inject themselves daily. Poor folk couldn't afford to inject drugs. It was believed that injecting morphine wasn't addictive. Quitting habitual opium use can cause malaise, flu-like symptoms, and depression. Morphine seemed an excellent cure. Early optimism about morphine's non-addictive nature proved sadly misplaced. The morphine-filled syringe would prove to be a lifesaver during the American Civil War, bringing fast relief to soldiers bleeding out on the battlefield and numbing the pain as a surgeon sawed off an appendage. Due to its widespread use, many soldiers ended up addicted after the war came to a close. It was called the Army's disease, with whole legions of veterans' lives being ruined by the drug on both sides. Addiction was not only taking place with men, though. Women came to be seen as especially vulnerable to opiate dependence. The most likely candidate for addiction, according to American doctor R. Bathalo, was
a delicate female, having light blue eyes and flaxen hair, who possesses, according to my observations, the maximum susceptibility.
In the late 19th century America, opiates were cheap, legal, and abundant. In the judgment of one historian, America became a dope fiend's paradise. When the Chinese were brought into America to help build the railroads, the already addicted men brought with them their practice of smoking opium in dens. Those who frequented opium dens would lie on their hips, which is where we get the concept of someone being hip, and words like hipster and hippie. Dr. Hamilton Wright, who was appointed U.S. Opium Commissioner in 1908, blamed the Chinese vice for corrupting the nation's youth.
One of the most unfortunate phases of the habit of smoking opium in this country was the large number of women who have become involved and were living as common law wives or cohabitating with Chinese in the Chinatowns of our various cities.
Dr. Wright is now considered a xenophobic racist. In 1875, San Francisco passed the Opium Den Ordinance, which banned smoking opium within city limits, with Chinatown being the exception. This was the first drug law in America's history. As the world dealt with the epidemic of opium and morphine addiction, pharmacists were supposedly working on a non-addictive alternative. In 1874, English pharmacist C.R. Alder Wright boiled morphine and acetic acid to produce diacetylmorphine, which is around 3 times more potent than morphine. You now know this drug by the brand name it was given in 1898 by German pharmaceutical giant Bayer, heroin. Heroin began being marketed and sold to the general public, including children, as a diluted form of morphine, supposedly without the harmful morphine side effects. It would wreak havoc upon the world in the years to come.
It's so good, don't even try it once.
In the late 19th century, it was believed that if the addictive properties of opium could be filtered out, then only its therapeutic essence would be captured. Henrik Dresser was in charge of drug development at Bayer, testing heroin on animals, humans, and most notably himself. He was impressed with the results. He pronounced heroin an effective treatment for a variety of respiratory ailments, especially bronchitis, asthma, and tuberculosis. Heroin was commercially manufactured beginning in 1898. It was advertised by Bayer as the sedative for coughs. The new wonder drug enjoyed widespread acceptance in the medical profession. This was because heroin induces a serene, unmanic euphoria with minimal interference with sensation, motor skills, or intellect. Although chronic opioid use typically diminishes the inclination to abstract thought, Bayer was soon enthusiastically selling heroin to dozens of countries. Free samples were handed out to physicians. It was sold at Sears with a syringe, supplies, and a carrying case. It was recommended as a safe alternative to morphine for addicts trying to shake their dependency, and flooded the market in many forms: tinctures, pills, even heroin throat lozenges. The philanthropic St. James Society in the U.S. mounted a campaign to supply free samples of heroin through the mail to morphine addicts who were trying to give up their habits. When injected, heroin provides an extremely powerful rush. After 4 to 8 hours, the effects start to wear off. Tolerance develops to the effects, so users tend to increase their daily dose, sometimes as much as 100-fold or more if financial resources permit. However, financial resources frequently did not. The term junkie derives from addicts who stole junk metal to support their habit. In the first years of the 20th century in America, heroin addiction rose at alarming rates. Various medical journals began to discuss the side effects of heroin, arguing that patients were suffering from heroin withdrawal symptoms which were equal to morphine addiction. Dr. John Witherspoon, later president of the American Medical Association, made pleas to the medical community.
Save our people from the clutches of this hydra-headed monster which stalks abroad through the civilized world, wrecking lives and happy homes, filling our jails and lunatic asylums, and taking from these unfortunates the precious promise of eternal life.
Nevertheless, the medical profession remained largely unaware of the potential risk of heroin addiction. Eventually, news filtered out. Doctors noticed that some of their patients were consuming inordinate quantities of heroin-based cough remedies. It turned out that heroin was not the miracle cure for morphine addiction that some of its early promoters had supposed. In 1913, Bayer halted production. They wrote the drug out of their official company history and focused instead on marketing their second blockbuster drug, aspirin. While the medical community took some time to respond, the U.S. government acted much more quickly. The U.S. Congress decided to ban the sale of opium to the public in 1905, creating the first federal drug prohibition. The passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 forced manufacturers to disclose the contents of their products, so consumers wary of heroin could know if it was present in the cough syrup they were giving to their children. In 1908, President Theodore Roosevelt appointed Hamilton Wright, a doctor from Ohio, to be the nation's first opium commissioner. Wright warned that Americans, quote, have become the greatest drug fiends in the world. In 1909, Congress passed the Opium Exclusion Act, banning its import for the purpose of smoking. Roosevelt sent Wright to lead an American delegation to the First International Opium Commission in Shanghai in 1909, and another gathering at The Hague in 1912, which produced the first global attempt to regulate narcotics. Dr. Wright told the New York Times,
"The habit has this nation in its grip to an astonishing extent. Our prisons and our hospitals are full of victims of it. It has robbed 10,000 businessmen of moral sense and made them beasts who prey upon their fellows. It has become one of the most fertile causes of unhappiness and sin in the United States."
Wright continued to push for U.S. legislation over the objections of drug manufacturers. This effort culminated in the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, which taxed and tightly regulated the sale and distribution of opium and cocaine-based products. This was the first broad crackdown, but narcotics prohibition was just getting started. Opium was not the only vice the government had in its sights to ban. Alcohol was next on the chopping block, as alcoholism, family violence, and saloon-based political corruption were seen as a scourge on American life. With the introduction of the 18th Amendment in 1917, the era of prohibition was starting, with all legal production of alcoholic beverages grinding to a halt nationwide by 1920. Then, in 1923, the U.S. Treasury Department's Narcotics Division, the first federal drug agency, banned all legal narcotics sales. With the prohibition of legal venues to purchase alcohol, heroin and other illegal drug addicts were now going to have to buy from illegal street dealers. This, in turn, led to the explosion of mob activity in America, with organized crime becoming very big business. Along with bootlegging alcohol, the mafia was also peddling heroin. Contrary to the myth that the mafia didn't touch drugs as it was unmanly to do so, they were involved from its earliest days. While some old-school Italian mafiosos may have had some objections to selling heroin, the Jewish gangsters did not. Jews at the time dominated the drug business in New York. Smack, the street slang for heroin, comes from schmeck, the Yiddish word for smell. Prohibition-era gangsters like Arnold Rothstein from New York City, who trafficked in illegal heroin, would become the country's first drug kingpins in the 1920s. According to crime writer Leo Katcher, Rothstein, quote, transformed organized crime from a thuggish activity by hoodlums into a big business, run like a corporation with himself at the top. Rothstein is blamed for having fixed the 1919 World Series in what is known as the Black Sox scandal. At the same time, there was the Purple Gang handling the vice industry in Detroit. The Purple Gang was the only major organized crime group with all Jewish leadership during the Prohibition era. They got their name from their Jewish neighbors who said they reminded them of spoiled meat. Purple. While there were many very powerful Jewish gangsters on the East Coast and in Chicago, they were allied with non-Jews, mainly the Italians. But in Detroit, the Purple Gang had the most powerful gangsters during the 1920s, and they were the key suppliers of bootleg whiskey to Al Capone. The Detroit police pinned 500 murders on them, and during their reign, Detroit had actually had a higher murder rate than New York and Chicago. On the East Coast, there was the largely Jewish and Italian gang known as Murder Inc. Famous Jewish mobsters such as Meyer Lansky, Mickey Cohen, Harold Hookie Rothman, Dutch Schultz, and Bugsy Siegel developed close ties with and gained significant influence within the Italian mafia.
Meyer Lansky was born around 1902. His real birth date is not known. His family lived in the Russian town of Grodno, a center of trade on the Polish border with a thriving Jewish community. Little Meyer studied Hebrew and went to this synagogue often with his beloved grandparents. But Jewish life under the Russian Tsars was not easy. As a boy, Meyer witnessed firsthand the brutality of the pogroms, the methodical persecution of the Jews by the Tsar's dreaded Cossack brigades.
When the Jewish community where he lived was suffering particularly, there was a young Jew who stood up and suggested that instead of just lying down, the community should fight back, that young Jewish men should go off to the woods and train and use weapons. And that appealed to Lansky, and all his life he had a chip on his shoulder, and that story was what he produced to rationalize what he became.
Meyer's family decided to flee Russia for the United States in March 1911. The ocean voyage was rough, but tough 9-year-old Meyer was too proud to be seasick in front of his mother. He went out on deck to get sick over the railing. For 2 years, the family lived in an apartment house in a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn. When Meyer's father could no longer afford the rent, he moved his family to a tenement on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. There, more than 500,000 people, mostly Irish, Italians, and Jews, were packed into 2 square miles of crowded city blocks. Meyer got excellent grades in school, but when he wasn't studying, he was out on the streets. He was sucked in right away by the criminal world, and the most seductive part of that world was gambling.
A story Lansky always used to tell was of the night before the Jewish Sabbath in the Lower East Side, when his mother would entrust him with a pot of stew to be taken to the baker's oven, and he was always sent with a nickel to pay the baker for the use of the heat.
On his trips to New York, Lansky began to sniff out rallies of Nazi sympathizers like the German-American Bund. Then he would show up with a truckload of goons and break up the rally.
Mr. Lansky, why are the American authorities after you?
Because the newspaper man started a campaign against me, and it snowballed to such an extent that I guess it can't be stopped anymore. I was singled out for some reason. They needed an image. And this has gone to an extent where it just snowballed, and I don't know how far it's going to go.
Mr. Lansky, what does the name Jewish Mafia mean to you?
You know, I never heard that until I read it in the Israeli newspapers. Why, it's most ridiculous.
Are there many Jews in the gambling business?
Well, when you say many, you'd have to judge by percentage. I think if you took the percentage of the gambling business in the United States, took the Jews, you would find them maybe in that proportion.
So let's get down to business as quickly as possible. Let me tell you the story. I'm here to tell a story about the tremendous contributions that were made by the Jewish mob during the for the betterment of the welfare of the Jewish people during from the 20th century going forward. Specifically, their participation in fighting the American Nazi Party in the 1930s, and the remarkable contribution that they made to help both Haganah and Irgun in the struggle for independence from the British and for the establishment of the State of Israel. So let's, I want you to think, keep this thought in mind as I tell the story. It's once you're going to have a problem, because I have a problem sometimes figuring out who are the patriots and who are the pirates. If you take an Israeli patriot that was born or raised in Palestine, and he in turn was brought to the United States, and he was born and raised here, or was raised here in the United States, he may very well have turned out to have become a Jewish gangster. By the same token, take a gangster and have him raised in Palestine, he might very well have been a Jewish patriot. So I want you to keep that thought in mind as I tell my story. So let's begin with the formation of the Jewish mob. Where do we begin? So we begin in the ghettos of every major city of the United States. Now, I come from Newark, New Jersey. My father, Allah B'Shalom, was born in Newark, New Jersey. My father was part of that world, and I'm the last one to tell the story. So and I'm proud to be able to tell this story because I have a responsibility to share an important part of history with Jews throughout the entire world, for that matter. So, it begins with gangs. It begins in the neighborhoods, in the ghettos. These kids were tough kids, and there was poverty, and there was struggle for money, a struggle to survive, to take care of your parents. It wasn't parents taking care of kids, it was kids taking care of parents, their immigrant parents, and so forth and so forth. In the ghettos, and particularly I can tell you the story in the 3rd Ward of Newark, New Jersey, which was Prince Street Ghetto. So what would happen is when the pushcart guys were being attacked by the Shkutzim, by the Goyim, by the anti-Semitim, they'd come in and they'd start beating up on the old Jews. So the old Jews would call the local gangsters. All of the kids, 15, 16, 17-year-old kids, come, defend us, because you're defending your father, you're defending your uncles, you're defending your brothers, your cousins, and so forth and so forth. We're getting beat up. Well, this is not going to happen. In that generation, the Jews are not going to take it with beating on the head and bowing their head. And just like what happened in 1903 in Kishinev, in Europe at that time with the pogroms and so forth, we had a Jabotinsky that went and said, no, 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 no. You're not going to do this to us anymore. We're going to have defense. The 20th century, the turn of the 20th century becomes pivotal in terms of that we're no going to longer be submitting and bowing our heads. We're going to fight back. So these kids fought back. They fought back to protect the Jewish neighborhood. 1920. Well, we all know that 1920 was the passing of the Volstead, the prohibition, and this was a tremendous opportunity for immigrants. Jews, Italians, Irish, Polish, everybody could benefit from making money where all the opportunities, the doors were closed for all other kinds of possibilities. A lot of our people went into prohibition.
The mafia would soon become a consolidated business under the direction of Salvatore Lucky Luciano. The notorious Sicilian mobster had started out in organized crime as a teenager, heading his own gang that provided protection to Jewish youngsters from Irish and Italian gangs for 10 cents a week. He was later shown the ropes of bootlegging by previously mentioned Arnold the Brain Rothstein, who acted as Luciano's mentor and helped him rise to the top. For example, in 1923, Luciano was caught in a sting selling heroin to undercover agents. Although he saw no jail time, being outed as a drug peddler damaged his reputation among his high-class associates and customers. To salvage his reputation, Rothstein advised Luciano to get himself some nice suits and buy 200 expensive seats to the Jack Dempsey-Louis Firpo boxing match in the Bronx and distribute them to top gangsters and politicians. Rothstein's plan worked, and Luciano's reputation was saved. Luciano worked his way up through the ranks of New York City's crime world, outwitting and outwhacking his rivals, having the powerful bosses Joe Maserio and Salvatore Maranzano killed. Luciano was the first official boss of the modern Genovese crime family. Luciano, unlike many of the old-school Sicilian crime bosses, was open to working with other ethnicities and made close alliances with some Irish mobsters and many Jews, so they could all pool their resources and dominate vice in America. This was the idea behind the Commission, a national crime syndicate that was largely organized by Meyer Lansky. It brought together La Cosa Nostra with the Kosher Nostra. Although Lansky and Siegel were unable to hold any official titles within the Luciano crime family as they were non-Italians, they were still highly respected. In order to be successful in their enterprise, the Commission had to eliminate the so-called mustache Petes, or the Sicilian-born gangsters who often refused to work with non-Italians, and even non-Sicilians. Some of this history concerning Lansky, Siegel, Rothstein, and Luciano, and their heroin business is brought forth in the recent TV show Boardwalk Empire. Due to their bootlegging businesses, the mafia practically had license to print their own money. But when the prohibition was replaced in 1933, after the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, heroin really started to become a viable source of income. Although there were less drug addicts than drinkers in the country, the profit margin with drugs would be much greater and drugs would be easier to smuggle. Bags of powder do not clank around and break in crates when being unloaded off ships in the dead of night. The U.S. government's hemp ban of 1937 also was a big boon to the mafia's heroin business. However, the commission hit something of a setback when its head, Lucky Luciano, was tried and successfully convicted for compulsory prostitution and running a prostitution racket in 1936 after years of investigation by District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey. Luciano was given a 30-year prison sentence. In a few years, World War II broke out and the U.S. was afraid of German activity in the East Coast ports, which were run by the mob, especially in New York City. A deal was struck between the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which would become the CIA, and imprisoned Luciano, with Lansky brokering the deal. As a proud Jew, Lansky and the Kosher Nostra were seen as allies against the Nazis. Under Lansky's direction, Luciano's crime syndicate would keep the docks running, free from strike and secure, and also provide intelligence and mafia contacts in Italy to help prepare for the Allied invasion. In return, Luciano's sentence would be commuted. This collaboration between the Navy and the mafia became known as Operation Underworld. On January 3, 1946, as a reward for his wartime cooperation, Dewey, who had put Luciano away 10 years earlier, commuted Luciano's sentence on condition that he did not resist deportation to Italy. Within 2 years after Luciano returned to Italy, the U.S. government deported over 100 more mafiosi as well, who would go on to help Luciano establish an unrivaled heroin trafficking network. Prior to the mafia's large-scale entry into the drug business, most of the heroin used by America's addicts came from China. A lesser supply came from the Middle East and the Corsican gangs in Marseille. During World War II, this network was severely disrupted. The fighting on land and sea in and around Europe and North Africa and Japan's attack of China in effect dismantled the foundation of the heroin manufacturers and the trade routes over which the drug was distributed. Without heroin available, demand lessened in the United States, but this was soon to change after the Allied victory. Heroin manufacturing after the war was aided by the Central Intelligence Agency, which had taken over from the OSS, the organization that helped to free Luciano. In 1947, in its first year of existence, the CIA continued the U.S. intelligence community's supposed anti-communist campaign. CIA operatives helped the mafia seize total power in Sicily and also sent money to heroin-smuggling Corsican mobsters in Marseille to assist in the battle with communist unions for control of the city's docks. Corsicans had at least a decade of experience under their belts. Illegal heroin labs were first discovered near Marseille, France in 1937. These labs were run by the legendary Corsican gang leader Paul Carbone. For years, the Corsican underworld was involved in the manufacturing and trafficking of illegal heroin abroad, primarily to the United States. Much of the raw material for heroin was coming from Turkey. Turkish farmers were licensed to grow opium poppies for sale to legal drug companies. But many sold their excess to the underworld market, where it was manufactured into heroin and transported to the United States. The morphine paste was refined in Corsican laboratories in Marseille, one of the busiest ports in the western Mediterranean Sea. The Marseille heroin was reputed for its quality, which is often correlated with its color, with white being the most pure and brown being the least. It soon became clear that the French underground was increasing not only its participation in the illegal trade of opium, but also its expertise and efficiency in heroin trafficking. On March 17, 1947, 28 pounds of heroin were found on the French liner Saint-Tropez. On January 7, 1949, more than 50 pounds of opium and heroin were seized on the French ship Batista. By 1951, Luciano and the Corsicans had pooled their resources, giving rise to the notorious French Connection, which would dominate the world heroin trade until the early 1970s. The narcotics syndicate Luciano organized after World War II remains one of the most incredible in the history of heroin trafficking. For more than a decade, it moved morphine base from the Middle East to Europe, transformed it into heroin, and then exported it in substantial quantities to the United States, all without ever suffering a major arrest or seizure. The organization's comprehensive distribution network within the United States increased the number of active addicts from an estimated 20,000 at the close of the war to 60,000 in 1952 and to 150,000 by 1965. Once heroin had been manufactured and packaged for export, Luciano used his mafia connections to send it through a maze of international routes to the United States. Not all of the mafiosi deported from the United States stayed in Sicily. To reduce the chance of seizure, Luciano had placed many of them in such European cities as Milan, Hamburg, Paris, and of course Marseille, so they could forward the heroin to the United States after it arrived from Sicily concealed in fruits, vegetables, or candy. From Europe, heroin was shipped directly to New York or smuggled through Canada and Cuba. While Luciano's prestige and organizational genius were an invaluable asset, a large part of his success was due to his ability to pick reliable subordinates. After he was deported from the United States in 1946, he charged his longtime associate Meyer Lansky with the responsibility of managing his financial empire. Lansky also played a key role in organizing Luciano's heroin syndicate. He supervised smuggling operations, negotiated with Corsican heroin manufacturers, and managed the collection and concealment of the enormous profits. Lansky's control over the Caribbean and his relationship with the Florida-based Trafficante family were of particular importance, since many of the heroin shipments passed through Cuba or Florida on their way to America's urban markets. For almost 20 years, the Luciano Lansky Trafficante Troika remained a major feature of the international heroin traffic. The Cuban Revolution in 1959 forced Trafficante and Lansky to write off their valuable casino and hotel operations, which they had developed with their profits, as a total loss. However, Cubans fled from Castro, which ended up being a blessing for the mafia men who had many contacts within Cuban organized crime. With Latin couriers, new routes could be opened up, bringing European heroin into Miami through Latin America. Many analysts have misinterpreted the appearance of Cuban and South American couriers and distributors to mean that America's organized crime had given up the heroin trade. The Justice Department's Operation Eagle revealed something of this new organization when in June 1970, 350 federal narcotics agents made 139 arrests in the largest federal law enforcement operation ever conducted against a single narcotics distribution ring. Although the arrests were carried out in 10 cities, the Bureau of Narcotics stated that all 5 of the ringleaders were Spanish-speaking and 3 were Cubans residing in Miami. The first major French connection case occurred in 1960. In June, an informant told a drug agent in Lebanon that Mauricio Rosal, the Guatemalan ambassador to Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, was smuggling base from Beirut, Lebanon, to Marseille. Narcotics agents had been seizing about 200 pounds of heroin in a typical year, but intelligence showed that the Corsican traffickers were smuggling in 200 pounds every other week. Rosal alone in 1 year had used his diplomatic status to bring in about 440 pounds. Meanwhile, there were major arrests throughout Italy, as well as warfare between the old and new mafiosos, with their very different style of conducting business. But the biggest challenge they would have to overcome was the loss of Lucky Luciano. While drinking a cup of coffee at Naples Airport on the evening of January 22, 1962, Luciano suffered a fatal coronary attack. The death of the man who had organized the post-war heroin trade kept it running against considerable adversity and was thought to be personally responsible for shipping more than $150 million worth of heroin into the United States over a 16-year period, was an irreplaceable loss. Without Luciano's organizational genius, it became increasingly difficult for Mediterranean smugglers to survive against the growing pressure of international law enforcement efforts. The most important blow to the Mediterranean heroin complex, however, came in 1967 when the Turkish government announced plans to reduce and eventually abolish opium production. The U.S. government contributed $3 million to build up a special 750-man police narcotics unit, finance research for substitute crops, and improve the managerial efficiency of the government regulatory agency, the Turkish Marketing Organization. Since Turkey's poppy fields were the major source of raw materials for Marseille's heroin laboratories, the impact of the Turkish government's declaration was obvious. Yet somehow the French connection was still continuing to flood American streets. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics' 1960 annual report estimated that from 2,600 to 5,000 pounds of heroin were coming into the United States annually from France. The traffickers in France continued to exploit the demand for their illegal product, and by 1969, they were supplying the United States with 80 to 90% of its heroin. A short, pudgy Jewish gangster called Herbie Sperling was one of the biggest heroin dealers of the 1960s and early 70s on the entire East Coast. Working with his Jewish partners and associates out of the famous Stage Delicatessen, he helped move hundreds or maybe thousands of kilos of heroin from the Italian mafia and their so-called French connection to the top black and Latin dealers in New York. Sperling was renowned for his foul mouth and extreme violence, and actually got his start in crime working as a gopher for one of America's most powerful and dangerous mob bosses, Vito Genovese. Arrested along with 17 others, he was indicted, tried, and sentenced to life, plus 30 years. Sperling was one of the first drug traffickers to get a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But his story was not over. While in Atlanta Federal Prison in 1979, he was indicted for hiring 3 black inmates to murder a mobster named Vincent Papa. Papa had orchestrated the theft of around 400 pounds of heroin and cocaine, $70 million of drugs, including the infamous French Connection heroin from New York Police Evidence Room, which was the department's Fort Knox, with bomb-proof walls and castle-strength doors. Using a fake policeman to get inside, Papa had the drugs replaced with flour and then taken out. He was aided by ex-cops from the SIU Special Investigating Unit of the NYPD Narcotics Division, which was a notoriously corrupt law enforcement agency. Because it was discovered that back in 1972 Papa had cooperated with the law ratting out crooked cops, the higher-ups in the cartel were worried he was about to start naming big names and he had to go. 2 black inmates were convicted of murdering Papa and had more life sentences added to their terms, but Sperling was acquitted of conspiracy. In 1970, Meyer Lansky, who had spent 5 decades being a leading figure in the heroin business, fled to Israel to escape tax evasion charges in the U.S. Jewish gangsters had sent large amounts of money and weapons to the Jewish state during its early days, and Meyer Lansky had even overseen an operation in which the weapons were shipped from New York to the Jewish Irgun terrorist organization in Palestine. Many Jewish criminals have been able to seek asylum in Israel without facing extradition, but Meyer Lansky's reputation truly preceded him, and Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir decided to squash the scandal by deporting Lansky back to the U.S. after 2 years in Israel. He was soon acquitted of charges in 1974 and finished out his last years in Miami Beach, being highly monitored. The large sums of money made off of the illicit heroin trade were invested by the businessmen of the mafia into a number of different legitimate operations, such as the casinos in Las Vegas, long run by Jewish gangsters, and Hollywood, where Jews, gangsters, and Jewish gangsters are endlessly glorified, among other mind control agendas, working hand in hand with the U.S. government. Meyer Lansky and the mob were also behind the formation of the Mary Carter Paint Company in 1958, which also acted as a CIA front. The company would purchase prime real estate and transform it into Resorts International, which created famous casinos such as the Taj Mahal. Resorts International eventually ended up in the hands of Donald Trump in 1986, as detailed by the late Michael Collins Piper in Who Towers Behind Trump. Whether or not it was intentional, initial government regulations were what really brought the organized mafia to prominence in this country, handing them a monopoly of illicit drugs. Then Meyer Lansky worked out a deal with the U.S. government to protect the ports of the country from Nazis, in order to free Lucky Luciano, who was sent abroad to organize an industrial heroin trade, along with the help of CIA-backed Corsican mobsters. The U.S. government was apparently fine with the fact that the heroin smuggling mafia was in control of the ports in America, and it just could not seem to stop the epidemic of heroin use that exploded in the country, until finally some real detective work led to big arrests involving the French Connection. Although the French Connection ended up drying up, many new sources and routes for trafficking heroin would be developed, especially as a direct consequence of America's foreign wars, wherein the military effectively became foot soldiers for the mob.